Dr. James Carafano is the Heritage Foundation's Vice President of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies. Interestingly enough, he was a leader of the landing team, the transition team for the office of President-elect Trump at the Department of Homeland Security, an institution he knows well. From 2012 to 2014, Dr. Carafano served on the Homeland Security Advisory Council, convened by the Secretary of that department. Dr. Carafano was a career officer. He's a West Point graduate, a place where he has also taught, 25-year Army veteran. He has a master's degree from Georgetown University and a PhD from Georgetown, as well as a master's degree in master's degree in strategy from the U.S. Army War College. His most recent publication is Surviving the End, which addresses emergency preparedness. If you survive it, it's not the end, is it, Jim? I mean, I don't mean to quibble with you on that.
So that's the whole point.
That's okay. He also authored Wiki at War, Conflict in a Socially Networked World, a survey of the revolutionary impact of the internet age on national security, and he co-authored a textbook, Homeland Security, designed as a practical introduction to life in the era of terrorism. He's co-author with Paul Rosenzweig of Winning the Long War, Lessons from the Cold War for Defeating Terrorism and Preserving Freedom, which were coined the term, the Long War, which we've all become accustomed to use in this long war. As you know, tonight, by the way, I wanted to say, of course, Jim is a wonderful writer and analyst. I was just reading his recent piece from National Review, also picked up by the Daily Signal, that pertains to his topic tonight. It's called Assimilation, Not Integration, Prevents Young Immigrants from Turning to Terrorism. I recommend that article to you. His topic tonight is Next Steps in Immigration and National Security, the Global Response. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carafano.
What I'd like to do is touch on three things and then kind of throw it open. And I didn't actually think that I would ever have a career as a Trump-splainer, but apparently that's my job these days. So I'm happy to kind of talk about how the administration is settling in from my perspective and kind of what they're doing or planning on doing or how things are shaping up. So I'm happy to kind of talk about that because apparently that's all people want to talk about these days. We were in Fiji, right? Fiji is the end of the earth, right? Because when you get there, all you can do is start to come back. And we're in a cab, and the cab driver goes, "What is it with Trump? What's his problem?" And we're like, "Dude, we're in Fiji. Why do you care?" I mean, so you can't get away from it anywhere. But so I want to talk about three things. I want to offer up three propositions and then explain what I really mean. So I don't think border security is really a terrorist national security problem. I don't think immigration is really a terrorist national security problem. And I don't think refugees are really a terrorist national security problem. So why do I say that? And does that mean I don't care about any of those things and doing them right? And the answer is no, actually I care a lot, right? Start at the border, and oftentimes, since 9/11, when we frame the issue about border security, and we're primarily talking about the southern border, people say we have to secure our border because terrorists might walk across that. And we have a lot of concerns at the southern border, but actually we haven't seen a tremendous amount of verified activity. But and essentially what we have seen is we have seen terrorists try to come to the United States, and you pick a way that somebody can come here, and a terrorist has tried that, whether it's being smuggled in a shipping container or trying to traipse across a border. Or get a visa or anything else, right? So if your answer is, well, we have to close that off, otherwise a terrorist might come here, then if you follow that logic, nobody could ever come to the United States, right? And we've actually known this for a long time, and it's not even a post-9/11 phenomenon. If you look at the report that the 9/11 Commission did, not the 9/11 report, which kind of everybody reads, which is the bestseller, but if you look at the supplemental report, which they did, which I think is more correctly framed, which is terrorist travel. How do terrorists travel? They did a very, very good job of kind of documenting how terrorists traveled up to 9/11, and the answer was lots of diverse different ways. And what we've seen post 9/11 is exactly the same. Lots of diverse different ways of trying to travel, because always looking for where is the weak spot, where to do this. And there is no constant. It's constantly evolving and changing and everything else. So there's lots of good reasons, though, that whether you're concerned about terrorists or not traipsing across the southern border, why we ought to secure the southern border. And the primary driver of insecurity and danger on the southern border remains the criminal cartels. They feed everything, right? You don't like illegal immigration? Blame the terrorist cartels, because they are the engine that fuels that. We have this image in our head of kind of, people walking up to the border and walking across. And what really happens is you walk up to the river and grandma goes to the local cartel guy and she pays him, whatever, $5,000 for permission to walk across the river. And then if she actually wants somebody to get there, then you pay, some more. So the cartels are the vast economic engine that's driving a lot of that. The other problem really is kind of just stupid, right? Because essentially the large part of traffic we're seeing now is not people kind of illegally trying to race across the border. They are people that essentially walk up to a point of entry and say, I'm a refugee, or I'm claiming asylum, right? And essentially it's a policy and interpretation of the law by the Obama administration, which basically says, why are you paying, their answer was to why are you paying somebody $10,000 when you just walk up to the border and we'll, as long as you can, claim you're a child or a family thing, we'll let you in. So we have a lot of stupid policy that's fueling it, but regardless of just the human migration, the cartels drive everything. When I first started talking about this stuff when I came to Heritage 15 years ago, I said, this is a $40 billion a year industry. $40 billion a year industry. And, post the recession, I said, they're the only business that didn't ask for, TARP money, today, the cartels have transformed, but it's an $80 billion industry, and it's growing. And it's even not just us anymore. People say, well, let's just legalize drugs and have amnesty and the cartels will go away. And that is so not true, because there are so many different, they have created so many different venues for fundraising. There's a tremendously powerful pipeline now that goes through North Africa, taking drugs into Western Europe and taking arms trade from South Asia into Mexico. So they have, like any good company that's got a lot of profits to plow back into it, it's not much difference between Google and the cartels, right? They're diversifying, to kind of secure their income. So this is a major, massively powerful thing that is the number one threat to the border. And taking down the cartels is the number one and most important thing. And, to this administration's credit, they've actually doing several things that the last administration did not. One is they're not stupid. When I worked in the State Department transition team up to the election, and then from the election to the inauguration, I worked on the Department of Homeland Security transition team, and it was really interesting too in two different departments, because they were both screwed up, but they were both screwed up in different ways. In the Department of State, that department's largely screwed up because under the 8 years under Obama, they added a massive amount of programs which were designed to do things that Obama thought were fun, but actually weren't terribly useful for the hardcore interests of statecraft. So there, I think you have a massive kind of structural issue in terms of programs and how you're spending money and wiring diagrams and everything else. So it's how the place is put together that's the problem. In DHS, you had exactly a different kind of problem. It wasn't DHS per se. It's that they were operating under a bunch of policies which were actually designed to make it impossible for them to do their job. So in many ways, fixing DHS, particularly on the immigration and border security issues, has been a lot easier, because it's just being like, stop being stupid, right? Stop having incredibly weird interpretations of the refugee law that's actually encouraging people to flood into the country rather than discouraging from risking their lives and destabilizing countries. Just adapting a much more sensible approach to the border, I think, is the right answer. And the other thing is a comprehensive approach to the border. One of the problems is not just Obama, but Bush, they could always say, well, we're making progress. Because they'd look at a place and think, oh, look, it's gotten better here, right? Well, I can show you 20 years of that, right? Matter of fact, we have a reporter that's going down to El Paso, which is now rated one of the safest cities in America. Well, how did that happen? Well, the answer is simple. The bad guys just moved on, because that's what bad guys do, right? So when you have an area of the border that gets so intolerably bad, and the political pressure at the federal and state, people just they go in there, and what happens is what the cartels do is they fight back, they push back, but then it's pretty clear that it's just easier to make money someplace else, and then they just kind of leave, right? So El Paso's quieted down, but the cartels have moved out elsewhere. 20 years ago, I could walk into Juarez, and have a great afternoon, and buy a piñata and everything. It was fine. A number of years ago, I could walk into Juarez and you'd never see me again, right? Because it was the most violent places on earth. Now it's a little quieter. Why is that? It's because the cartel moves, the smuggling routes move to where where it's easiest to make money. And so if you don't actually interdict them across the operating space, right, across all then you never disrupt the model, right? Forcing them to change their business practices a little, but preventing them in a sense from delivering their product, whether it's people, guns, money, or drugs, that crimps the cartels. And so this addressing security across the border comprehensively in a way in which their business practices just can't keep up is the right answer. So actually enforce the laws, comprehensively address it across the border. And then the third component is actually working with the Mexicans. And when you put aside the kind of bad rhetoric back and forth on both sides, this administration actually does want to work with Mexico. Mexico actually has a vested interest in this because much of the illegal migration we're seeing right now isn't starting in Mexico. It's actually starting in Central America, and it's coming through Mexico. And why that's bad is it's creating additional stress on the Mexicans, and it's also feeding more cartels into the money. So it's a struggle for them. They have to. Mexico's problem is not that we're building a wall. Mexico's problem is it has a crappy economy. It has a lot of corruption. It has a lot of public safety issues. And the only answer to that is a better Mexico, right? And this is an administration that actually isn't really interested on walling off Mexico or destroying Mexico. It wants Mexico to be a better partner in the hemisphere. So while the public rhetoric is bad, I think behind the scenes, there's actually interest on both sides. Within the limits of what's going to happen with the elections in Mexico the next year about doing things in the U.S.-Mexican relationship that are actually constructive and positive for both. So when I say I don't worry about terrorists at the border, it's a way they could come here, but like dealing with everything else, the answer is a better border. Right? So whether we're worried about terrorists or not, we need a better border. And the only way we're going to get a better border is if we're better at addressing the end-to-end problem. Which takes me to my lessons. I don't worry about immigration. I don't worry about domestically. So one of the things we do at Heritage Foundation is we have a database of every known Islamist plot aimed at the United States since 9/11. Right? So there's a good story how this came about. Anybody know Mike Frank? Oh yeah, Mike Frank used to be at Heritage. Mike Frank came in the hall one day. He was a VP, and I wasn't at that time. And says, "How many terrorist attacks have there been since 9/11?" So this is just like a couple of years after 9/11, I thought, oh, Mike, what a stupid question, right? Because I wouldn't say that because he was the vice president, right? But in my head, I'm going, this is stupid. Because I was the Homeland Security guy. I deal with this stuff every day. And I go, well, I know all this. I go, it's probably, I don't know, maybe 11. Everybody remembers Richard Reed, right? It was right after 9/11. And there was a couple other yahoos. And I said, I don't know, maybe 11. Because I think that'd be interesting, right? We should do a paper on that. People should know that. I don't think people know that. And since Mike was the vice president, rather than saying, Mike, don't make any work for me, just go away, dude. I said, oh, Mike, great idea. Let me get right on that, right? Because I figured, well, this isn't hard. I'll just go back and have my research, have my interns, go through the thing. And actually they came back and they surprised me because it was actually like 17. So they're actually Islamist plots and these are just publicly known plots. So obviously not stuff that was covertly thwarted or, the CIA killed some, but, stuff that we know because there's either a court or a police record where we can document that there was an actual plot that was thwarted in one way or another. So I thought, man, that's actually more than I thought. That's, Mike's not a dumb guy after all. I said, but I was a little nervous because, like, we're going to publish this report and then somebody's going to go, oh, well, your statistics are off or whatever and everything. So at the time, since it was the Bush administration, I actually had people in the Justice Department who would return my phone call, right? I like called the counterterrorism guy at the FBI and I said, hey, we just did this study on Islamist terror plots since 9/11. And can we look at you and compare it to your list? Because I don't want to put out something that, is incredible. He looked at me and he goes, on the phone, he looked at me through the phone. He goes, you have a list? He goes, you have a list? He goes, can you fax me your list? And I'm like, you don't have a list? You're the FBI. So we would, and every time there was a new plot, we would periodically update it to the point where there were, I don't know if you've noticed it, but the number of Islamist terror plots aimed at the United States in the last 8 years has skyrocketed. It's grown dramatically since 2010, which was right about the time Obama declared that we'd won the war on terror. And so so we actually just created an interactive online database where we keep the data. You can go on our website at heritage.org and tap into it. It's great. It tells you who's the plot, where they came from, what they're, we do all kinds of interesting things. It's very, the Indian embassy recently came to us and said, hey, do you realize how many of these plots actually have a Pakistan connection? So only an Indian would think of that, right? And we went through it. It was actually a not insignificant percentage of the Islamist plots aimed against the United States have a Pakistan connection, which is interesting things you can do with the database. But we're up to I can't remember exactly. I'm pretty sure it's 94. So we've had 94 Islamist-related terror plots since 9/11. Of course, that's not all attacks. A lot of those were thwarted. What have we seen? So we've seen an increasingly dramatic increase in the number of plots in the last 8 years. And virtually every plot we've seen, not everyone, but vast majority are what we would call homegrown, in the sense that even if there was some kind of connection overseas, that by and large operationally was put together and organized within the United States almost exclusively. Okay, so when you add up every person involved in that, that's less than 200 people. Actually, it's a little over 100 some odd people who are actively involved in a plot. In all the plots. Then if you want to throw in every known case of material support, and you probably heard the FBI director before say every FBI joint task force in the country has an ongoing ISIS investigation at one point. So we have 100-something FBI joint task force. And there have been hundreds of cases. And then you probably remember the statistic that I think they put out for the last EO about the number of refugee cases where there had been a terrorism investigation, either involved in a terrorist activity or a known case of material support. So if you want to add up every case of material support where somebody's been convicted or something, that's about a population of about 1,000. So that means the radicalized population in the United States, not people that have wacky, crazy thoughts, let's, put Sharia in every community or something, but the people that actually taken up arms or supported the taking up arms against the United States or its allies, that's a population of somewhere about 1,200. Last time I checked, we had a population of about 320 million. Right. So we have, I'm not saying we don't have an Islamic political threat in the United States. I think there are lots of groups in the United States that have bad politics, that are inconsistent with the United States and the Constitution. I wouldn't argue that. But in terms of the number of people that we've had in the United States who are interested, who are working on actual terrorist activities, compared to the size of our population, it's pretty tiny. And it's not consistent, right? One of the things we tried to do is do a database of where are these plots coming from. So not where they're attacking, but where are they coming from? Where do they start? And there isn't actually a clear pattern. It's I can find you cases where somebody got radicalized in a mosque. I can find you a case where they weren't. I can find you a case where they were an immigrant. I can find you a case where they're a refugee. I can find you a case where they were Christian that converted to Islam. I mean, the problem is with these numbers is, and increasingly actually what we're finding is people are just radicalizing where they are and attacking near their home. So it's not necessarily in the Somali community in Minnesota. It's not. It's actually kind of spread all over the country. So, I have my line, which is, terrorists are a very small percentage of any database other than other terrorists. So when you look at the radicalized terrorist threat that's in the United States domestically, my argument is the way you find them is you go look for terrorists, right? So we have this notion about, where do terrorists come from? Do they come out of prisons, or do they come out of mosques, or do they come out of whatever? Or, what are they going to do? Is it going to be a car bomb or a dirty bomb? And my answer is, don't look for who you think they might be, and don't look for what you think they might do. Go and look for them. Because like 99% of a terrorist activity, whether it's the process of who they connect with, operational, looks the same. What looks different is kind of the front end to the back end, who they are, how they get started, and what they do at the other end, right? Whether it's going into a workplace and shooting everybody up, or attacking a nightclub, or running somebody over in a car. So focus on the things that are indicators of actual terrorist activity. And that's why the vast number of plots that we've done since 9/11 have actually been thwarted. Because they've been thwarted because people actually went out and they did the kind of law enforcement investigations, intelligence sharing, information sharing, penetrating communities, flipping people, doing honeypot traps and stuff that actually catch people and terrorists. So if you're doing counter-radicalization, my argument is you stay very close. You're very close to the line of where people are working between kind of suspicious activity and clearly terrorist activity, as opposed to saying, I've got to, have a message that, tells everybody in the country that they shouldn't be terrorists or something like that. And my main concern that we had the last 8 years is my greatest was really just, there's probably a better word for it, but just political correctness. Is that essentially what we were doing was we were laying on policy after policy after policy, which was more concerned about not being offensive or antagonizing anybody, right? Except demonizing people who are concerned about this, that was okay, right? And what you were doing was actually beginning to kind of inhibit the practical practice of good counterterrorism activities, good kind of activities, that kind of traditional law enforcement activities of community engagement, intelligence-led policing that actually stop and prevent, terrorist acts, just like they stop and prevent criminal acts. And so, again, I'm hoping that's something that's going to disappear. I think certainly from the federal level, there's a concerted effort about getting rid of political correctness. It's not about demonizing any community or any group, or even getting into necessarily into an ideological debate in general. It's about enabling law enforcement throughout the country to do the things that we know, that work. We've been at this business for a couple of decades now. And we actually, in the United States, kind of know what works and what doesn't. And it's like really obvious as you do the things that work and you stop doing the stupid things that don't. The last part is refugees, right? Or immigrants or whatever, people coming from other countries. I don't necessarily think that's a terrorist problem. But, as I said, if there's a way to get to the United States, terrorists will try to do that. The United States has been a much harder target after 9/11 than it was before. You can see that in the nature of our plots. It's harder for people to get here. So in turn, what they've done is just kind of, lob something over the door and say, hey, go kill somebody for us, right? It's, encouraging or incentivizing or, a domestic threat. And, they've had a modicum of success. We saw that in Orlando. We saw it in San Bernardino in California. But actually getting here and do it yourself is kind of harder, right? And a matter of fact, one of the big criticisms of the president's executive order was, well, that's stupid because terrorists aren't coming here, right? They're here, right? But that's true, but the threat is dynamic and changing. And we've said that if there's a way to get here, terrorists have tried it before and they'll try it again. So we have very clear evidence that agents of ISIS have, through visas and the refugee flow, gone into Western Europe with the goal of doing terrorist attacks, right? I was just talking to the Hungarians the other day who have clear things of people coming into the Hungarian refugee camp in Hungary, connecting with people in France and Paris and organizing a terrorist attack. So We have seen this before. Only an idiot would say, well, this is just not realistic, that a terrorist is going to try to get a visa or come in as a refugee. We've seen them try to do it in other countries. Why would they try to do it here? And I think the argument for the executive order really had nothing to do with the campaign rhetoric, right? So whatever Mr. Trump might have said at the campaign trail about banning this or barring that or whatever rhetoric people thought they might have heard or interpreted, the impulse for the executive order came out of looking at the strategic environment and where the future threat might come from and trying to be preemptive and block that before it happened. And one of the things that I was very frustrated with in the last 8 years is after having declared victory in the war on terrorism in 2010, because he went to Cairo and he made a speech, right? He said, we don't have a problem with you. I told them I have a problem with this. Obviously, they won't come after us anymore, right? The problem only metastasized. I mean, by the end of the president's term, there were more terrorists than there were when he came in. There were more deaths from terrorism than there were when he came in. Terrorists controlled more territory than when by every objective measure, the threat of transnational terrorism was far greater at the end of President Obama's term than there was at the beginning. And part of that I attribute to everything we did in the Obama years was largely reactive, right? We backed away from everything, and then we only went back in and did something that when we saw there was a problem. So we walked away from Iraq, and we only went back when it looked like ISIS was going to walk into Baghdad. We tried to walk out of Afghanistan, and it got so bad we kind of walked back. Right? We didn't do anything about ISIS until they declared themselves a caliphate. They never did anything at Al Qaeda, and as most of you know, because this is a pretty wise crowd, right? I mean, Al Qaeda's global footprint today is bigger than it was on 9/11, right? And all that growth has come in the last several years. Everything we did was reactive, because we were afraid to do anything proactively because we didn't want to be offensive to anyone. We didn't want to hurt anybody's opinion unless they were conservative, then we were okay with that. But we wanted to withdraw from the world. We wanted to engage and enable people. We wanted to do less, not more. But in being reactive, we created this enormous space and opportunity for ISIS and Al Qaeda to innovate, and they've done that. So what I actually liked about the executive order dealing with travel coming out of the Middle East, it was trying to be proactive and anticipate, because there's two significant shifts in the threat environment that we've seen coming out of the Middle East. The one is that we had tens of thousands of foreign fighters flow into the Middle East, into Iraq, Syria, to fight on behalf of ISIS. As ISIS loses physical space, and those guys, the ones that are left, are going to go somewhere. And they're going to go to largely to the 6 countries that were named in the executive order. We think that's where they're going to go. And why should we presume that they're just going to sit there and not try to leave from there to go to the West or come to the United States and attack us? So having extra concerns about screening people out of those countries makes perfect sense. And to be honest, that the Obama administration saw that coming. They were adding restrictions. Congress added restrictions. And if you talk to the Europeans and you say, give me a list of countries that you're really concerned about in the region, they're going to give you the exact same list of countries. So it's the natural list of countries to be concerned about. The second thing that's changed in the environment is we still don't know what ISIS 2.0 is going to look like. Right? I have not talked to anybody yet that doesn't agree that taking down the black flag in Raqqa and Mosul is a good idea. Right? Because what it does is it physically destroys the myth of the caliphate. This notion that somehow the new historical epoch is upon us, and we did something that Al Qaeda didn't. We have actually physically established the caliphate. ISIS has now been degraded and dishonored, right? Because their caliphate is being wiped out the face of the earth. I don't think that means ISIS goes quietly into the night. There's lots of space in the region that they can operate from, and we don't know exactly what ISIS 2.0 is going to look like, but here's what we do know is one way for them to get back in the game is the way Al Qaeda originally got in the game, which was to do something spectacular to show that they are a powerful force to be reckoned with, that they still have honor and they demand respect and honor and allegiance, right? So will ISIS go from kind of what they've been doing the last several years, which is basically just cheerleading for terrorism, right? And I mean cheerleading for terrorism, and as many of you know, in many of the cases and plots we've seen around the world, it's more than just ISIS saying, go do a terrorist attack. I mean, they've actually gone online and talked people through this and provided them guidance and operational control, if not necessarily material support and training. But they've been more proactive and more engaged in just saying, go forth and kill. But largely what they've done is, in a sense, to demonstrate their global reach, is they've encouraged kind of the global attacks. Okay, that's probably not good enough for ISIS 2.0. I mean, ISIS 2.0 may have to go from just encouraging terrorist attacks to actually directing and orchestrating terrorist attacks to show that they're still in the game. Because we don't know, are they going to fade back into Al-Qaeda? Are they going to compete with Al-Qaeda? And we've already seen them been aggressive in a number of different areas. We used to say, a couple of years ago, ISIS had a global laydown, but it didn't look the same everywhere, and you didn't treat it the same anywhere, right? So people who are more sophisticated would say you have to look at every little case on its own merit. But when we looked at places like Afghanistan, for example, and we said, there's ISIS in Afghanistan, they said, yeah, but what that really is that's just splinter factions of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and they're just rebounding to kind of show their independence, right? We're not sure that's true anymore, right? I mean, increasingly we're thinking that there's ISIS in Afghanistan, and they are separate and distinct from Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and they're trying a new power center. India, right? So if we sat down and talked 3 or 4 years ago and say, do you have an ISIS problem in India, right? So something that's not necessarily directed or related to support for transnational terrorism from Pakistan, right? You'd largely say, well, kind of no, right? I mean, we have ISIS in India, but it's, a couple of yahoos in their garage saying, let's go be ISIS today, right? Now, even the Indians are trying to say, we may actually have a threat that goes beyond that. We had a case in, I want to say Hong Kong or Singapore? Singapore of, and correct me if I'm wrong if it's Hong Kong, could be, we're also familiar. But we actually had local women who were nannies who self-radicalized and organized their own material support network to bring terrorists from Southeast Asia to there and then over to Iraq and Syria. We've seen a serious effort in recent years to develop an ISIS basis in the Philippines. We know about problems we have in Libya. We've got problems in Yemen. We see ISIS competing with Al-Qaeda in Yemen. So we don't know what ISIS 2.0 is going to look like. But I think trying to be proactive, try to get ahead of the threat, and look beyond just taking down the black flag in Mosul and Raqqa. How do we take away their space to operate in the Middle East? How do we prevent new flare-ups from rising? These are things that the administration is thinking about, and I give them kudos for trying to be proactive on that front. So, people ask me, do I care about border security? I say, damn straight. Do I care about immigration? I say, yeah. Do I care about refugee flows? I say, what? Maybe not primarily because of the terrorist threat, but if there is a network or a thing that terrorists might exploit, only an idiot would not do due diligence and make sure that we've thought about that and addressed that. And I give this administration credit for at least being a little more forward-thinking and a little more creative, and for once trying to get ahead of a threat and start the trend back in the opposite direction than trying to figure out how to ignore the threat, even as it went in the upward direction. So I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to talk about whatever you guys want to talk about, and until you get tired of talking.
There are a couple of things that seem contradictory to me that I would like you to respond to. One was, you rightly observed that if we really want to ensure that no terrorists cross the border, even though most of them are homegrown anyway, then we have to close the border to everybody. Obviously, that's a ridiculous policy, the cost to the economy and so on would be overwhelming. That was exactly my reaction to the travel ban. How does that pass a cost-benefit assessment?
So it's a great question, right? So those countries were chosen because those are the countries where the foreign fighter flow is likely to dump into and will likely try to dump out of, right? The other thing that all those countries had in common, except for Iran, which is a state sponsor of terrorism, which is kind of Iran's on the list, is they have weak governance and exit control on the confidence that the government itself can actually do much to ensure that their contributions to the screening and exit process are adequate. Actually, one of the reasons why Iraq came off the list, right, and which demonstrates, well, even if you want to say 7 countries is a Muslim ban, even though we know there are a lot more countries that have a lot bigger Muslim populations that aren't even close to being banned, right? The Iraq coming off the list, I think, clearly demonstrates it's not a Muslim ban, because you look at the reason why Iraq came off the list. Now, of those countries, again, with the exception of Iran, which is a case unto itself, the Iraqis do have some superior level of governance, and in terms of people that could come through an official channel through Iraq to the United States, they have a good degree of control over that. And the Iraqis got so freaked out on the first travel ban that basically all the things that they weren't doing for us, they came to the table and said, we'll do these things. And so that created a level of confidence in the Iraqi system that said, okay, we don't have to ban you. The other countries, even if they said, I'll do that for you, I think our level of confidence that they have the capacity to do that are pretty low. The other thing I would say is, what the government did was not unreasonable. As a matter of fact, the people that really track this stuff would actually go to you and came to me and said, what's the big deal here? The restrictions on visas now are so severe coming out of these countries, how much frickin' harder can you make it? And so the criticism of the people that actually do this stuff wasn't that it was draconian and harsh. It was much ado about nothing because there wasn't much more that you can do. My response to them was, okay, maybe that's a fair argument. On the refugee thing, I think the challenge for the incoming administration is pretty simple, right? There was a very clear effort on the part of the last administration to take more refugees as a political statement. Right? It wasn't about solving the refugee flow, right? Because we could have tripled, quadrupled, and whatever our refugee flow, and that wasn't going to dent it, right? I mean, there are millions going into Europe. I mean, unless we're going to start taking 1 million people, and they think there's about 1 million have gone to Europe so far. They think there's about another 6 million in the pipeline, right? So unless we're going to take a 2 or 3 million people, we're not going to. So it was largely a political statement about trying to up the numbers. It wasn't about actually dealing with the problem. And the administration came in from the perspective of what's the maximum number of people we can push through, as opposed to what's the appropriate number of people that we can actually screen appropriately and handle, right? And I think the incoming administration had no confidence that the outgoing administration was saying, are we vetting appropriately and correctly for the capacity and the ability we have to do that, or are we just force feeding people through the system to get the numbers up? And in fairness to them, there's not a lot of way they could determine that the day before the inauguration, because even during the transition period, a lot of what's done is classified, and unless you have a clearance, which a lot of people in the transition didn't, you couldn't even talk about it. And then you couldn't talk about it. So there's really no way in a transition to really deal with the classified matters of screening stuff. That can only happen after the after the inauguration. And then the challenge for the incoming administration is look, if there's a terrorist attack the day after the inauguration, nobody is going to say the defense of, well, we just did what the Obama guy did is an adequate defense, right? The guy got elected to protect Americans against transnational terrorism. His clock starts on day one. He's responsible. So I do think the administration felt extra pressure because they did see this start emerging to make sure that they had policies and procedures in place that were suitable and adequate on day one. And again, kind of in fairness to the refugee processing to come to the United States is not quick now. So a imposition of a couple of additional months is not a threat to an individual or person, because remember, these are people that are not in conflict zones. they have already moved to a place where they're in a refugee camp, right? So under the Geneva Convention, in a sense, the international community has already given those people everything it's required to do, right? The first place where they get to, where they're not physically in danger anymore, right, in a host country, that's where their refugee status is, right? For them to then leave that country and go someplace else, right? That's between those countries and that country and the refugee. There's no humanitarian requirement to take them from a refugee camp and bring them to the United States. We choose to do that. So it's hard to make the argument that that refugee is in, their life is in danger, right? Because they're already in a refugee camp. That means that they're already in a place where they have food and water, and theoretically, you know, they're not going to get killed, right? And since the process takes months anyway, to say, well, we're going to add a couple of months to that, if you're trying to prevent a known threat, which is, we've actually seen people try to go through refugee things as a terrorist, when you do that balance, I don't think it's an unreasonable, you know, risk assessment to do that, to say, let's add a couple of months and make sure that we're confident in a system that we didn't create and we know has been politicized for years. So you know, but I'm not a judge in Hawaii, so what do I know? Yeah, sir.
Thank you, Doctor, for being with us this evening. I appreciate your comments. I understood you to imply that what we needed to do was more police work investigation type of thing to identify terrorists in advance. Maybe I'm mistaken in that, but that was my understanding. I know that the New York Police Department had a capability to identify and track and monitor and try and do preventive police work, and I believe that was disestablished and required to be stood down. There are other areas such as some of the training that was being done in some of our military places and some of our Homeland Security people and so forth at Conoco or wherever. And I know that some of the politically correct changes were made to some of that material, and some of the people who were involved in teaching, who were well knowledgeable, were relieved of their duties because they were taking a line that was not politically correct. How is that faring now with a different administration?
Yeah, that's a great question. The administration has come in with a very skeptical eye, right? And you know, rather than just kind of throw out the baby with the bathwater on day one, they actually, I think, have been very interested in kind of assessing what's being done and whether it makes sense or not before we move forward. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So one is there was a multi-million-dollar grant program for combating domestic radicalization. And shockingly and coincidentally, all that money was kind of programmed to go right out the door, like in December, right before the inauguration. And so one of the things the incoming administration did is when they came aboard, they kind of put a timeout. They said, look, we want to review this process to see if that makes sense. So they weren't saying, we're going to throw this away. They were saying, we want to evaluate this. There's a big discussion about, do you call it CVE? And, you know, is the term Islamic, you know, radical terrorism okay? There's a thoughtful discussion. We're not saying, there's nobody in the White House has said, okay, you will do this. But what they've done is say, look, you know, show me the books. Let's go through these programs and explain to me why this makes sense. Another good example is the global engagement project, or whatever it's called, in the Department of State, which is supposed to be the external venue for, you know, kind of U.S. contribution, kind of fighting global, you know, extremism or radicalization. You know, grew up out of nowhere, has, you know, independent hiring authorities that almost no other federal agency has. They have a pipeline of money that comes from DOD through the National Defense Authorization Act. And it was like, whoa, time out here, you know? So, so people are looking at that program and saying, does this make sense? Is this, you know, how we're doing things? So I think they've been very, you know, deliberative. You know, and you can see the difference, right? You can tell what we worked on in the transition team because it was an executive order, like the day after. I mean, so in the transition, they did everything that you could do before actually running the government to kind of put your policies in place. If it didn't happen in the first couple of weeks, right, it's because it's not something you could really do in the transition, or it wasn't necessarily a presidential priority. So now what you're seeing is there are things like, which have to kind of go through the system, right? And so, so they might take a little longer, but I think that's actually good. I mean, yeah.
Is Bloomberg and de Blasio coming back online to?
Oh, I doubt it, you know, no, I doubt it. I mean, I think they're just yahoos. I mean,
That's what worries.
but, you know, I mean, I think this is part of the concern about sanctuary cities. I mean, one of the problems with sanctuary cities is, you know, divorcing law enforcement cooperation from the federal and state and local is, you know, there's nothing in enforcing immigration law that says cities and states have to enforce immigration law. But in a sense, not cooperating, or in the case where we have, you know, withdrawing, cities where they've withdrawn from a joint terrorism task force, you are creating a space for criminal activity to operate, right? Nobody's asking you to do the federal government's job, but by not cooperating, you are creating space for people to get killed. And, you know, how much that'll continue and endure, I don't know. Yeah.
You mentioned the need
Oh.
to get us to a better Mexico. Is there a plan for that? And what can we expect from Trump in the war on drugs?
Both are good questions. I don't know if there's a plan, because you know, this takes two sides. And the challenge here is you have a Mexican government that is extremely unpopular, that is really worrying about getting reelected, that has an electorate that's kind of anti-American, right? And then right now, and you have a socialist government, which would be even worse, right? So they've got some stuff to negotiate their way through, and you know, we're about a year after the election, so you know, what can the two sides actually accomplish? I don't know if you can have a plan for that. I think what you have is an engagement, and then you see what you can constructively do. On the, you know, what are they going to do about, you know, the epidemic on OxyContin and heroin and the war on drugs? I don't know. I know that Secretary Kelly, as somebody who was a former Southcom commander who saw the problem from both ends, both the push from the cartels in the South and the destructive influence that had on Latin America and on creating a threat here, but also on the pull here on the demand side, that's something that he's personally really concerned about. How this administration is going to engage in that, you know, I don't know. Are they going to do a kind of narrow, you know, PR-focused campaign, or are they going to do something more, I mean, you know, people like me would argue, you know, if you had families, you know, if people are educated, you know, people were people of faith, you know, if communities were you know, didn't have, you know, parentless children, you know, there might, you know, might be a lot less drugs there. So, but I don't know what kind of approach they're going to take. But it is something I think they want to be serious about. I'm not sure the decision's made how, because I think they're probably different ideas. Sir.
Like this gentleman, I was very impressed by your discussion of police work, and I was impressed by your description of cycles, Bush, Obama, Trump. And I would carry it back further. Clinton, and the two Janets, one of whom reappeared under
Right.
Obama, they demonized profiling, they demonized proper police work, not to the extent
Right.
that Obama did.
Right.
They started that. And when it turned out to be Timothy McVeigh, they went to town demonizing the American people
Yeah.
for supposedly demonizing the Islam, for having the very practical common sense assumption that it was probably Islamic terrorism. Just turned out that time not to be. That set the stage for 9/11. It certainly helped contribute to it. Bush takes us into another cycle, but it seems to me the ideology which the Clinton administration established remained prevalent in the mass media throughout the Bush administration. The primary pressure should be on the American people for being Islamophobic and needing to show that they trust Muslims, rather than on the Islamic community to show that it's loyal. That set the stage for Obama, once again, to bring that ideology to power and enforce it much more substantially. The question to me is, how can we get out of this cycle? How can we have a consistent policy that will survive, not only throughout an entire 8 years, but it was already weakening under Bush? Why did they let people out of Guantanamo? Because they were under such pressure. Work under Trump and survive after. And can it be done if Trump communicates better on this issue? It's got to go beyond just saying radical Islamic terrorism. It's got to really explain the matter. Or would the entire mass media of the United States have to collapse because of its own orientation for putting pressure on the Americans?
So So I would rephrase that question
Okay.
as to how can we have law enforcement and public safety in communities that's actually responsive to the needs of the community and not driven by the political agenda of the community leaders, right? And one way in which Clinton was responsible for that kind of destructive behavior is, one of the things that happened under Clinton, if you remember correctly, is you know, when Gingrich had his heyday and Clinton was trying to get reelected, and he kind of got into the mode of, okay, we're going to be fiscally conservative and we're going to rein back on federal spending. And it was Clinton or Gore that famously said the era of big government is over.
Clinton.
It was Clinton said that, right? So here's what he meant. He didn't mean that he didn't mean that he didn't want big government. What he meant was, I don't have a lot of money to grow government anymore, so I have to get creative and innovative in finding other ways to grow government, right? And one of the small ways that they found to increase the expansion of the federal influence in state and local government was through the COPS program and the firefighter grants. And they were relatively small amounts of money, but what they were trying to do is funneling money directly into state and local governments to, you know, put cops on the payroll, put firemen in the field, and conservatives kind of everybody went along with that because, like, who wouldn't want, you know, who doesn't think we need more cops or anything else? But what you were doing was creating a new space of entitlement programs, right? Which now become incredibly difficult for anybody to turn off, right? Even, you know, I mean, if you go to conservatives and say, I want to cut out, you know, grant programs for cops or grant programs for firefighters, forget it, it's not going to happen. So what has that done? Well, you've kind of given, like always, you've given a cash flow to these political leaders at the state and local government, which essentially allows them to kind of a degree of independence from the voters that they work for. And it's, I think, damaged the level of responsiveness. So it's not about, you know, more effective law enforcement at the state and local level is not about the federal government taking over state and local law enforcement. And it's not about us giving them dumps of money. It's about each doing its role appropriately and each being responsible to the voters and resources. So I think, you know, we've helped created this unhealthy, so we don't like, you know, what the mayor in New York is doing. We give billions of dollars, not billions of dollars, we get many tens of millions of dollars to New York to help police themselves and protect themselves, right? Because it's a big target and everything else. But that's also allowing the mayor to kind of do what he wants. So I don't think sanctuary cities are the answer to solving illegal immigration in the United States. I think there are other things that are much, much more important. But I do think that sanctuary cities are a symptom of a serious disease where, you know, we're giving Bill Clinton exactly what he wanted, right? We're making people dependent on the federal government in ways that they like, right? So now we've got mayors who are snubbing the federal laws and ignoring federal laws while we're paying them, right? And making it easier for them to do that, right? So for Jeff Sessions to say, you know, look, we're not going to give you money if you're going to scoff the federal laws, I kind of applaud that. Actually, I'd say let's not give money at all, you know, but that's me. So, yeah, who's got the microphone? Oh, I guess, does somebody else have a microphone? You have a microphone.
Great presentation. Thank you, Mr. Carafano. Some years ago, I attended a series of conferences put on by some military types, generals and others, and at a certain point, it became pretty clear it had to do with the Colombian narco guerrilla trafficking problem, and it was extremely complicated, and it was very depressing. And in one of the periods between different sessions, I spoke with someone from the State Department, I didn't ask his name, said, what's it going to take to stop this? And he said, it's not going to happen because there's too much money in it. He said the banks are in this to their eyeballs. Was that a wrong assessment? And you talked about the cartel.
Yeah.
Could you say
So,
something about the cartels?
so there's two things that I think are really noteworthy. One is one of the things that a difference in this administration that I do think is different is they've taken, they're interested in a much more robust strategy in dealing with the pipelines that fuel, whether it's terrorist activity or criminal activity in the transnational world, right? So, we see the kind of the well-publicized things like, well, we're stopping the oil flow to ISIS or something. But these guys use an enormous amount of different instruments to raise and move cash. ISIS, for example, was doing currency manipulation. Cigarette smuggling is something that terrorist activities use just as much as criminal activities, and countries like North Korea. So, and people can give you 1,000 reasons why you don't go after that, right? 1,000 reasons why don't go after that bank, right? We know they're doing business with North Korea, but I can give you 5,000 reasons why that's not a good idea. And so there is more interest in this administration in going after the spectrum of vehicles that are being used to fund transnational criminal activities and state sponsorship and terrorism and terrorist activities. And I think that's all for the good. And so I'm excited to see if that comes to fruition. There's a lot of interest on that in the transition and in the presidency. It's a complicated, difficult thing, but we'll see if it's operational. I think we'll get an early signal of that when the administration comes out with its North Korea policy, because sanctioning North Korea, everybody thinks North Korea is the most sanctioned place on earth, and it's really not. One of my guys ran the numbers. There were more people in Zimbabwe that are sanctioned than there are entities in North Korea that are sanctioned. And the reason for that is there are a lot of Chinese banks that you'd have to make very upset, right? And I think this administration is potentially willing to do that. So I think how we rank up North Korean sanctions will be an early thing on it. The other thing, again, where hopefully there's a difference between this administration and the last administration, is the last administration was supportive and pushed and rushed the peace deal in Colombia with the FARC. And rather than ensuring a deal that would ensure the FARC never rise again, it was much more important that we got a deal than that we could all run off and get our Nobel Peace Prize. And so I think that we've created a space for that to come back, and that's bad because we need Colombia to be a success. We don't need another resurgence of that. And I think our work in Colombia is not done yet, and that's unfortunate because we need Colombia to be a positive and constructive force in the region. So, and again, the good thing I think about Kelly is, as a former South commander, is he gets a lot of this, and he instinctively understands the need for homeland defense and state to work together and to kind of cover some of these gaps and seams. And I think we'll see more of that. I think the most excited time I had in the transition thing was when I heard, because none of them were cabinet secretaries at that point, but they were all nominees. When I would brief somebody on something and says, yeah, I'm going to talk to what's his name about that. Or we talked about that. I mean, they were already cross-talking, even before, that's very promising. And hope, but maybe, I don't know if it'll actually transcend into the thing, but we do wacky, stupid things in Latin America because, the State Department won't let the Defense Department do something, and they won't tolerate Homeland duty, instead of just kind of getting together and figuring out how to get the job done.
Thank you for coming to
Sure.
share your insight tonight.
No, you're good.
Preempt somebody?
No.
We've seen in the news a habit that in European countries that has resulted from liberal immigration programs in such places as Paris, France, England, and the Netherlands, and others. What do you think the prospects are in the future here in the United States as to what might result insofar as the extent to which we have had similar immigration policies in the past?
So, our challenge isn't on the scale of the Europeans, right? So their demographics are much slower growing, right? So the impact of immigrant populations is unbalanced them much more quickly than the United States. We've always had very different paths to assimilation. Traditionally in the United States, and Muslims were actually kind of a typical immigrant population in the modern era, in that they were geographically dispersed throughout. There are few, but they kind of were everywhere. They vary in socioeconomic levels, right? Even in Muslim communities, you find Sunni and Shia, and a guy from Iran, and a guy from here. The European model, as you well know, is very, very different. People tend to clump in specific areas. They tend to be in the same lower economic order. They tend not to assimilate very quickly. They tend to be all the people from one village, all go to one place and everything. So the Europeans have a horrible assimilation model, and that's caused a real problem. So one of the reasons why, Mike Gonzalez, my partner, and I wrote that article for National Review is we are screwing up our assimilation model, right? It's not about making everybody, the same, but our model is designed to not be Europe, right? Our model is designed not to bake into society ethnic and sectarian divisions, which are going to cause you, and ethnic, sectarian, and social economic divisions, which are going to cause you problems later on, right? And what we're doing is for the sake of identity politics, we're throwing that model out the window, right? So we have concerns over the long term with assimilation in the United States, because essentially what we did the last 8 years and what progressive policies will do is essentially take us to where Europe is, which we know that doesn't work, right? The numbers thing, is the challenge in Europe is just staggering. I mean, it's not just the million that they took; it's the 6 or 7 million that might come in after that. It's interesting I was just in Brussels, and it's interesting what you see, right? And what you see is not what you hear, right? So the rhetoric is still, we need to be welcoming, we need to take all these immigrants in, it's going to be great, we're going to get them jobs, it's going to be awesome, we're the best people, they're all going to become good Europeans, right? And although we hate those Hungarians, they put up a fence, they're horrible, terrible people, those Poles are awful people, how dare they do that, they're so un-European, shame on you, we hate you, right? But if you actually look at the policy that the Europeans are moving towards, they're starting to look a lot more like Hungary and Poland. Germany's trying to figure out how to get people out again, right? They're trying to figure out how not to take in another million refugees. So while their rhetoric hasn't changed, their policies have actually become much more unwelcoming and much more afraid and much more scrutiny. They've got a huge problem, and they're in massive denial on how to deal with it there. So, and the other challenge is the way they do law enforcement, right? I mean, they don't have, by and large across Western Europe, they don't have the capacity, the capabilities, and the skill sets that we have in terms of information-led, intelligence-led policing, community policing, getting into communities, accessing communities, language skills and everything else. Those are new things in Europe, and they're just racing to catch up. So they built these kind of radicalized fortresses, and now they're trying to figure out how to, penetrate them, because they just can't put them under siege, right? So it's not good to be a European. Yeah.
So on the theme of not being out here, it seems to me that listening to discussions from Europe about terrorism from well before 9/11,
right.
Europeans had a general concept of an acceptable level of terrorism,
yes.
terrorist violence,
right.
Yeah. And that seems to have carried on today. Mayor of London. The United States, it seems to me, at least the people have not accepted that the allowable level of terrorist violence is 0, although the last administration seems to be moving toward more of that view. So do you think I have that dichotomy right, first of all? And secondly, is it the investment to keep it at 0 is extremely high? Is it one that you see us willing to bear?
Yeah, so it's a bit more muddled than that, right? I'll tell you about my Freaky Friday moment. So nice to speak to an audience that's old enough to have seen Freaky Friday. Or maybe your kids saw it. So, after 9/11, the general European narrative was, you Americans, you just don't know how to deal with terrorism. We Europeans, we know how to deal with this. This is a law enforcement problem. It's something you tolerate. We can get through this. You Americans, you way overreact. This war on terrorism, that's ridiculous. What is wrong with you people, right? So a couple of years ago, I had a lunch with the French Interior Minister, which is very, very unusual. It was a very small group. There's only like 4 of us. And it was on the record, which was very unusual. And it was right after he had had a meeting with the director of CIA and head of the FBI and the National Security Advisor. And so he was basically having an honor record me because he just wanted to get this out. And it was, I want to say it was about a year. It was about a year before ISIS had really gone, big time. And at the time, between Belgium and France, they had the majority of the foreign fighters that had flown in, or had fled in, gone into the theater, and the numbers were 200, 250, which at the time seemed staggering, right? And this French minister, looked me in the eyes and said, what is wrong with you Americans? We're at war with these terrorists. Why are you guys treating this like a law? What is wrong with Obama? Right? Wait. I was like, oh my God, did we just switch places? Right? I mean, did you just become Dick Cheney? I mean, and now I'm Barack Obama. I mean, what's going on here? Right? I mean, so clearly the French government has been freaking. They have been freaking out for years on this. Some places are still in denial. I mean, the Germans are kind of still in denial because they haven't had their, Brussels or Paris, right? So you have a mixture throughout Europe, and some people are apoplectic and they think they're at war and they think that they're in an existential mode of survival. And there are some places which are kind of completely in denial and want to ignore it. And there are some places like in Central Europe where they don't have that problem yet, and they're like, dude, it's not going to happen here, we want to be part of the EU, we want to be free, whole, and whatever, except we don't want the terrorist thing, right? So Europeans are kind of all over, it's a mess, they're kind of all over the place on this, and that's kind of the way we are here, and that's just the sad thing, right, is terrorism has become a political issue, it hasn't become a security issue, right? If you worry about terrorism, you're a racist, xenophobic conservative, right? If you don't worry about terrorism, you're a weak-kneed liberal, right? Really? I mean, this is really, when people's politics, when their position on a security issue begins to get defined by their politics, that's the time to hit the red button. When a judge who is, issuing an injunction against the executive order is parroting the exact same language as the ACLU, who is parroting the exact same language and words as the Democratic opponents to the president in the Congress, we should all say, well, isn't that funny? What a coincidence. How did that happen, right? So, I mean, unfortunately, terrorism has gotten involved in this kind of hyper-partisan political environment that we're in. I think we're lucky. I think we have an administration that's going to do the right thing, regardless of whether they get attacked for, being mean and evil and everything else. So I think we're in a better space than the Europeans right now.
If I could take the privilege, first of all, thanking you, Jim, for a wonderful presentation, and lob you the last question. You said that you need to take down the black flag over Raqqa and Mosul, because that will teach a lesson in a certain way. But it certainly doesn't solve the problem in that ISIS is just the latest manifestation of an underlying problem that goes much, much, much deeper. So first Al-Qaeda, then ISIS, there are other, so the whack-a-mole problem. To what extent did you see either in the state transition or DHS any comprehension of the nature of the underlying problem?
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot, actually. I mean, Katie Gorka, who's somebody that's been affiliated with this institution a long time. I mean, Katie was, on the transition team, and she's in the Department of Homeland Security now. And I think she actually, there's, I think, an enormous amount of common vision within the incoming people that were involved in national security, including Kelly and Mattis. And I don't know Tillerson very well, but if you go through his testimony, which I had to do because we had to answer a lot of the questions before and after the hearing, and knowing HR and thing, I think there's an enormous amount of understanding that. So how does that manifest itself? One, I think, certainly in a regional strategy that is going to not just looking to defeat ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but helping, not by invading countries, but finding ways to eliminate spaces of instability and operation that give them a space to go in the region, which is important. The second, I think, is paying as much attention to Shia-inspired terrorism in Iran, and as they are to ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which I think is important. And the third thing is I don't think that there's going to be this notion to reflexively give support to the Islamist political movements. I mean, we actually had an administration, particularly in the case of Egypt, that actually thought that the answer to the ending terrorism and the future stability of the Middle East was just turn the Middle East over to the moderate Islamists, right? Like the Muslim Brotherhood, and that was going to solve our problem. I don't think there's anybody in this administration that thinks that's a good idea. So, I mean, I don't think you're going to see any support or for kind of hardcore Islamist governments or political movements. So it's not a bad start. Doesn't make the world.
Thank you very much.